Welcome, story lovers. We are about to open a new book and travel to the gritty, industrial heartland of 1920s America. To ensure you have a reserved seat for every chapter of our next great adventure, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Your support is what makes these stories possible. And now our story begins. The autumn of 1929 in the industrial town of Sterling Creek, Pennsylvania, was a season of quiet, creeping dread. The relentless optimism of the Roaring Twenties had begun to curdle, replaced by the bitter taste of economic uncertainty. The Sterling Vance steel mill, the town's lifeblood, was faltering. Orders were down, shifts were being cut, and a grim, anxious silence had replaced the once proud roar of its furnaces. For Eleonora Vance, the 35-year-old widow of the mill's late owner, this silence was a constant, suffocating reminder of everything she had lost. Her husband, Arthur, a man of visionary brilliance and boundless energy, had been the heart of both the mill and the town. His sudden death from a heart attack a year prior had left a power vacuum that was now being filled by his colder, more pragmatic younger brother Lawrence, a man who saw workers not as people, but as numbers on a ledger. Eleonora, once the respected mistress of a thriving empire, now found herself a ghost in her own life, a grieving widow with a controlling brother-in-law who was systematically dismantling her husband's legacy of compassionate leadership. Her one act of defiance, her one remaining piece of power, was her refusal to sell her controlling shares in the mill back to Lawrence. This stalemate had created a cold war between them. He could not completely gut the company, and she could not stop its slow, painful decline. The flashpoint of their conflict and the beginning of her new story came at a place that embodied the town's growing desperation: the weekly labor auction. It was a cruel but necessary institution, a place where the town's struggling factories and the new, massive government dam project could hire temporary, non-union labor from the desperate masses of the unemployed. Men, mostly recent immigrants from Italy, Ireland, and Poland, would gather in the cold, cavernous town hall, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and humiliation, waiting to be bought for a day's or a week's hard labor. Eleonora had come to the auction that morning on a mission of mercy. She had heard a rumor, a whisper of a new, brutal policy being implemented by her brother-in-law. Any immigrant worker at the mill who was accused of a mistake, no matter how small, would have their contract voided and be put up for auction to repay the debt of their supposed incompetence. It was a legal but profoundly immoral form of indentured servitude. She had come to witness the truth of it for herself. She stood at the back of the crowded, noisy hall, her elegant dark mourning clothes a stark contrast to the rough work coats of the other foremen and managers. The auctioneer's voice droned on, a monotonous litany of men's names and their skills. Then, a new man was brought to the block and a hush fell over the room. His name was Marco Rossi. He was a man in his late 20s, with the powerful, sculpted physique of a man who knew hard labor. His dark, wavy hair was matted with sweat, his face was bruised, and his clothes were torn. But it was his eyes that captured her. They were a deep, dark brown, and they burned with a fierce, unyielding pride and a contempt for the world that had brought him to this place. He was not a broken man. He was a caged lion. "This one's from the steel mill," the auctioneer announced, a sneer in his voice. "Accused of gross negligence. Dropped a tool, they say, jammed one of the big presses. Caused a whole day's delay. Mr. Sterling wants his due. The contract is for 1 month's hard labor to the highest bidder." Eleonora knew, with a sickening certainty, that it was a lie. The mill's foreman was a cruel man, known for his prejudice against the Italian workers. This man, Marco, was a scapegoat, a victim of her brother-in-law's ruthless new efficiency. The bidding was pathetically low. The other foreman saw a troublemaker, a man with a defiant look in his eye. The price stalled at a few paltry dollars. A month of a man's life, his strength, his spirit, was worth less than a new pair of shoes. It was in that moment that something inside Eleonora snapped. The quiet, grieving widow, the woman who had spent a year politely battling her brother-in-law in boardrooms, was gone. In her place was a queen, ready to defend the values her husband had lived by. She walked forward, her movements calm and deliberate, parting the sea of rough-coated men. She stopped before the auction block, her gaze fixed not on the auctioneer, but on the proud, defiant man standing there. $1, she had intended to say, a symbolic bid to shame the others. But as she looked at the man, at his unbroken spirit, a different, more powerful idea took hold. A grand, dramatic gesture that would be a declaration of war against her brother-in-law and everything he stood for. She slowly, deliberately, pulled off her black leather glove. She then twisted the magnificent diamond wedding ring from her finger. It was a famous piece, a flawless 5-carat diamond that had been the talk of the town, a symbol of her late husband's love and their family's immense wealth. She held it up, the diamond catching the light, a brilliant, blazing star in the gloomy hall. "I will not bid in dollars for a man's soul," she said, her voice a clear, ringing bell of authority that silenced the entire room. "But I will offer this. The full value of this ring, cashed and delivered to the mill for this man's contract, and for his freedom." A collective gasp went through the hall. It was an act of such shocking, magnificent defiance that no one knew how to react. She was not just buying a worker, she was making a statement. She was trading the most visible symbol of her old life, of her connection to the Sterling Vance dynasty, for the freedom of a single, unjustly accused immigrant. The auctioneer, utterly flummoxed, looked to the mill's foreman, who looked to Lawrence, who had been observing the proceedings from a shadowed corner. Lawrence's face was a mask of cold, white fury. He had been publicly, brilliantly, outmaneuvered by the one person he had sought to control. To refuse her offer would be to admit his own cruelty. To accept was to concede her victory. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Sold," the auctioneer finally stammered, his voice weak. "To Mrs. Vance." The deal was done. Eleonora walked up to the block. She did not look at the foreman or the auctioneer. She looked only at Marco Rossi, whose dark, burning eyes were now full of a profound, stunned disbelief. She extended her hand to him. It was not the gesture of a mistress to a servant, but of an equal to an equal. "Come, Mr. Rossi," she said, her voice a low, steady command. "You have work to do, for me." He hesitated for a moment, his pride warring with his astonishment. He then reached out and took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. Together, the grieving industrialist's widow and the immigrant she had just bought with her wedding ring walked out of the hall, leaving a trail of stunned silence in their wake. They were two strangers from two different worlds, now bound by a single, extraordinary, and deeply dangerous act of defiance. Their story had just begun. The walk from the cavernous, judgmental space of the town hall to the crisp autumn air outside was a journey of 1,000 unspoken emotions. Marco Rossi followed Eleonora Vance, his every instinct screaming at him that this was a trap. He was a man who had learned, through the harsh lessons of the immigrant experience, that kindness from the wealthy was never a gift. It was merely a different, more elegantly disguised form of a cage. The foreman from the mill had spat a curse at him as they left, a look of pure, venomous hatred in his eyes. The other men in the hall had stared with a mixture of awe and contempt. He was now the property of the town's grieving queen, a strange, unprecedented position that left him feeling more exposed and more vulnerable than he had on the auction block itself. Eleonora led him to a handsome, but not ostentatious, black Ford motor car parked on a side street. A chauffeur, a quiet, elderly man, held the door open, his face a mask of professional neutrality, though his eyes held a flicker of profound surprise as he looked at Marco's bruised and disheveled state. "This is Mr. Rossi, Thomas," Eleonora said, her voice calm and steady. "He will be coming to work at the house." The journey to her home was conducted in a thick, charged silence. Marco sat ramrod straight on the plush leather seat, his hands resting on his knees, his muscles coiled and ready for a betrayal he was certain was coming. He stared out the window at the passing town, at the neat, respectable houses, a world away from the crowded, noisy boarding house he shared with a dozen other Italian immigrants. He refused to look at her. To do so would be to acknowledge the strange, humiliating debt he now owed her. He was a proud man, a man whose strength was his only true possession. And this woman, with a single, dramatic gesture, had just bought it. The Vance estate was not a mansion, but a large, magnificent stone house, set back from the road amidst acres of old, wise-looking oak trees and the fading, beautiful colors of an autumn garden. It was a place of quiet, old-world elegance, but it was also a house in mourning. The gardens were slightly overgrown. The paint on the shutters was beginning to peel, and a profound, unshakable stillness hung in the air. It was a house, Marco sensed, that was holding its breath. Inside, the home was a testament to a life of quiet, cultured taste. It was filled with beautiful dark wood furniture, shelves of leather-bound books, and the lingering faint scent of his late wife's perfume. But a fine layer of dust coated every surface, and the air was cold and still. It was the home of a woman who had lost her center, a woman who was merely existing in a beautiful, silent museum of a life that had once been vibrant. Eleonora led him not to the servants' quarters, but into the grand, formal library. A fire had been laid in the magnificent stone fireplace but had not been lit. She gestured to one of the large, comfortable leather armchairs. "Please sit, Mr. Rossi," she said. He remained standing, his posture rigid. "I am not your guest, Mrs. Vance. I am the man you bought. Where is it you wish for me to begin my labor?" His words, so full of a proud, wounded bitterness, seemed to hang in the air between them. Eleonora looked at him, and for the first time, she saw past the caged lion to the terrified, cornered man beneath. She saw his fear, his suspicion, his fierce, unyielding pride. And she knew that her next words would determine everything. "You are correct, Mr. Rossi," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You are not my guest, and you are not my servant." She walked to the large window that overlooked the sprawling, silent grounds of the steel mill in the distance, a gray, industrial behemoth against the autumn sky. "I have brought you here because I wish to offer you a position, a partnership of a kind." He stared at her, his dark eyes narrowed with suspicion. "My husband, Arthur, built that mill," she began, her voice a low, steady murmur. "He built it on a foundation of respect for his men. He knew their names, their families. He believed that a company was a community. But since his death, his brother Lawrence has taken control of the operations, and Lawrence sees only numbers. He sees men like you not as assets, but as costs to be minimized. The accident you were blamed for, I know it was not your fault. It was an excuse, a way for him to break the union's hold by making an example of a man he thought had no power." She turned to face him, her own eyes now blazing with a quiet, righteous fire. "I am still the majority shareholder of that company, Mr. Rossi, but I am a woman, a grieving widow. In the boardroom, my voice is a polite suggestion that is easily ignored. I cannot fight him in his world of contracts and numbers, but I can fight him in other ways." She took a deep breath. "I did not save you from the auction block out of simple charity. I saved you because I recognized in you a man of strength, of pride, and of an honor that my brother-in-law would not understand. I have seen the way the other Italian workers at the mill look to you. You are a leader, whether you know it or not." She laid her proposition before him. "I need an ally, Mr. Rossi. I need someone on the inside. I am offering you a position not as a laborer, but as my personal foreman, my eyes and ears within the mill. I want you to organize the men, to document the unsafe conditions, the unfair practices, to give me the ammunition I need to go to the board and prove that Lawrence's ruthless methods are not just immoral, but are a danger to the company itself. I am offering you a chance not to repay a debt to me, but to win justice for yourself and for your fellow workers." It was a brilliant, audacious plan. It was also incredibly dangerous. She was asking him to be a spy in a lion's den, to risk the wrath of a powerful and ruthless man. But she was not offering him pity, She was offering him a war to fight, a war he was already fighting in his own heart. Marco was a man who had been used and discarded by the powerful his entire life. He had been taught to trust no one. But as he looked at this woman, at her fierce, intelligent eyes, at the undeniable truth of her words, he saw something he had never seen before. A member of the ruling class who was willing to stand with the workers, not against them. She was not offering him a cage, she was offering him a weapon. "And what is in this for you?" he asked, his voice a low, cautious rumble. "I get to save my husband's legacy," she said simply. "I get to ensure that the Sterling Vance steel mill remains a place of honor, not just of profit. And I get to sleep at night knowing I did not stand by and do nothing while a good man was unjustly condemned." The silence that followed was different. It was the silence of two generals assessing a battlefield, of two allies weighing the risks and rewards of a shared, dangerous campaign. He had come here expecting to be her servant. She was asking him to be her soldier. "I have one condition," he said finally. "Name it." "I will not live in this house," he stated, his pride a non-negotiable term. "I am not your ward. I will accept a fair wage for my work, a wage I will earn, and I will continue to live with my own people, in my own home. I will be your foreman, Mrs. Vance, but I will not be your pet project." Eleonora looked at the proud, unbending man before her, and a slow, beautiful smile of pure, unadulterated respect spread across her face. "Your condition is accepted, Mr. Rossi," she said. "Your duties will begin tomorrow." She extended her hand across the library desk. He took it, his grip firm and sure. The handshake sealed not a contract of servitude, but a partnership of rebellion. The grieving widow and the proud immigrant, two of the loneliest and most underestimated people in Sterling Creek, had just declared a quiet, secret war on the most powerful man in town. And in that shared dangerous purpose, the first fragile foundations of a new and unexpected kind of love were laid. Returning to the Sterling Vance steel mill the following morning was like willingly walking back into the jaws of a beast that had already tasted your blood. As Marco Rossi passed through the great smoke-belching gates, the familiar, oppressive clang of heavy machinery and the acrid smell of burning coal filled his senses. The other workers, men he had shared bread and grievances with just days before, now looked at him with a mixture of suspicion, envy, and fear. He was no longer one of them. He was now a creature of the enigmatic Mrs. Vance, a man whose contract had been bought with a diamond, a man who now moved in a strange, undefined space between the grit of the factory floor and the opulent world of the owners. His old life was over, and his new, dangerous one was just beginning. His first destination was the office of the mill's foreman, a cruel, hulking man named Henderson, who had taken a particular malicious pleasure in Marco's downfall. Henderson looked up from his desk as Marco entered, his face a mask of smug contempt. "Rossi," he sneered, "come to collect your final pay, have you? Or perhaps the grand lady grew tired of her new pet already?" "Mrs. Vance has given me a new position," Marco said, his voice a low, steady rumble, betraying none of the cold fury that was coiling in his gut. He handed Henderson a sealed envelope. Inside was a letter, penned in Eleonora's elegant script, on her late husband's official stationery. It was a masterpiece of corporate strategy. It did not mention Marco's old position. It simply stated that, in her capacity as majority shareholder, she was exercising her right to appoint a personal liaison to the factory floor, a man to act as a direct observer of operations and report on efficiency and worker morale. That man was to be Mr. Marco Rossi. He was to be given unrestricted access to all areas of the mill and was to report only to her. It was a brilliant move, a checkmate that used the very rules of the company against itself. Henderson's face turned a blotchy, furious red as he read the letter. He was being forced to harbor a spy, a man he had personally tried to break, and there was nothing he could do about it. The order came from the one person whose power on paper still superseded his own. "Get out of my sight, Rossi," Henderson snarled, crumpling the letter in his fist. But know this, you may have the lady's protection, but in here, you are still just a wop, and accidents happen. The threat was clear. Marco simply nodded, a cold, dangerous light in his own dark eyes, and walked out. The game had begun. His new role was a tightrope walk over a chasm of hostility. The other foreman treated him with a cold, suspicious disdain. The workers, his own countrymen, were wary, unsure if he was a traitor or a savior. He was a man utterly alone, a shadow moving through the fiery, hellish landscape of the mill. But Marco was a man of immense patience and keen observation. He did not try to win friends. He simply worked. He spent his days walking the factory floor, his eyes and ears open. He saw everything. He saw the unsafe machinery that Lawrence's cost-cutting measures had left in a state of dangerous disrepair. He saw the exhausted, underpaid men being forced to work double shifts. He saw the quiet, simmering rage that was the true, explosive fuel of the Sterling Vance steel mill. He began to document it all. At night, in the quiet of his small room in the boarding house, he would write detailed, meticulous reports for Eleonora. He did not write of opinions or feelings. He wrote of facts, the number of injuries on the pressing line that week, the exact measurements of the cracks in the furnace wall, the quiet, desperate words of a man who had not been paid his full wages. He was her soldier, gathering the intelligence she needed for their war. Their meetings were conducted in secret, under the cover of darkness. Once a week he would make his way to the Vance estate long after the town was asleep. He would not go to the front door. He would slip through a small, private gate in the garden, a gate to which Eleonora had given him a key. He would find her waiting for him in the library, a single lamp casting a warm, golden glow on the room, a pot of strong, hot coffee always ready. These clandestine meetings became the center of their separate worlds. In the quiet, fire-lit intimacy of the library, the grieving widow and the proud immigrant were no longer a mistress and her foreman. They were two co-conspirators, two generals planning a campaign. She would read his reports, her intelligent eyes absorbing every detail, her sharp mind making connections he had not seen. "This pattern of accidents on the number 3 press," she said one night, her finger tracing a line on one of his reports. "It is not just old machinery, Marco. It is deliberate. They are pushing the men too hard, skipping the safety checks, all to meet a quota that is impossible to fill safely. Lawrence is sacrificing the safety of his men for the sake of a few extra dollars on a contract. They are afraid to speak up," Marco said, his voice a low, frustrated growl. "To complain is to be fired, and to be fired is to starve." "Then we must give them a voice," she said, a new, determined light in her eyes. She began to use the information he provided, but with a surgeon's precision. She would write formal letters to the board of directors, not with vague complaints, but with specific, undeniable facts from Marco's reports. She would question the maintenance budget for the number 3 press. She would inquire about the high rate of turnover in a specific department. Her letters were a series of small, perfectly aimed arrows, each one striking a nerve, slowly, methodically, building a case against her brother-in-law's negligent management. Lawrence, in turn, was enraged. He knew this was not Eleonora's work alone. He knew she had an inside source. His suspicion fell immediately on the Italian worker she had so publicly saved, the man she had installed as her personal spy. His attacks on Marco became more vicious, more personal. Henderson, the foreman, following Lawrence's orders, would assign Marco the most dangerous, back-breaking tasks, hoping to break him, to force him to quit. But Marco did not break. He did the work, his body aching, his spirit fueled by a cold, quiet rage and by the memory of the woman who was waiting for him, who believed in him. His resilience, his quiet refusal to be intimidated, began to earn him a new kind of respect from the other workers. They saw him not as a spy for the owners, but as a man who was enduring the foreman's wrath on their behalf. They began to speak to him in hushed tones, to share their own stories, to give him more information, more ammunition for his secret war. One night, as he was leaving the Vance estate, Eleonora met him at the garden gate. The moon was a bright, silver coin in the clear, cold sky. "You are in great danger, Marco," she said, her voice a soft, worried whisper. "Lawrence will not stop until he has destroyed you." "I am not afraid of him," he said, his gaze steady. "But I am," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "I am afraid for you." Her words, a simple, heartfelt admission of her fear for his safety, were more intimate than any touch. In that moment, in the cool, moonlit garden, he saw not just the powerful, grieving widow who was his benefactor. He saw Eleonora, a woman of profound compassion, a woman whose own quiet strength gave him the courage to face the dangers of his world. He reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently, bravely covered hers where it rested on the iron gate. Her hand was small and soft, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "You do not need to be afraid for me, Signora," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "To have a queen fighting in your corner, it is enough to make any man feel like a king." Their fingers intertwined for a fraction of a second, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of the bond that was growing between them, a bond that was no longer just about justice or rebellion, but about something far more personal, far more dangerous, and far more beautiful. The line between soldier and queen was beginning to blur, and in the shared, dangerous shadows of their secret war, a new and unexpected love story was quietly beginning to be written. The secret war against Lawrence Sterling was a campaign waged not with armies, but with ink and whispers. Eleonora's weekly letters to the board of directors became a masterclass in strategic attrition. Armed with Marco's meticulous factual reports from the factory floor, she crafted missives of polite, razor-sharp precision. She never made accusations. She simply asked questions. Could the board clarify why the maintenance budget for the primary smelting furnace was cut by 60%, despite 3 official safety complaints from the floor foreman in the past month, she would write. I am also seeking information regarding the unusually high number of worker compensation claims, 7 in the last 2 weeks, originating from the number 3 pressing line. Is it possible the machinery is being run past its recommended operational capacity? Her letters were a slow, methodical poisoning of Lawrence's reputation. She was not the hysterical, grieving widow he had dismissed. She was a sharp, intelligent, and deeply informed shareholder who was exposing the rot beneath the surface of his profitable, but dangerous, management style. The board, initially dismissive of her, was now growing uneasy. Her facts were undeniable, and the specter of a catastrophic accident and the ensuing financial and legal fallout was a language they understood all too well. Lawrence's fury was immense. He knew, with a certainty that gnawed at his gut, that the source of this infuriatingly accurate information was the Italian worker his sister-in-law had so theatrically saved. His attacks on Marco intensified. He instructed Henderson, the foreman, to make Marco's life a living hell. Marco was assigned to the most dangerous, grueling, and undesirable jobs in the mill, cleaning the inside of the blast furnaces during maintenance shutdowns, working the graveyard shift on the notoriously unstable number 3 press, tasks designed to break his body and his spirit. But Marco Rossi was forged from a stronger material. He did the work without complaint, his quiet, unyielding endurance a silent act of defiance that did not go unnoticed by the other workers. The man they had once viewed with suspicion was now becoming a symbol of their own silent struggle. He was enduring the foreman's wrath for them, and their quiet, fearful respect for him began to grow into a fierce, underground loyalty. Men would approach him in the shadows of the factory yard, slipping him a piece of information, a warning about a faulty piece of equipment, another story of an injury that had been deliberately misreported by Henderson. He was no longer just Eleonora's spy. He had become the reluctant, unofficial leader of a silent rebellion. Their clandestine meetings in the library of the Vance estate became the nexus of this rebellion. The grand, quiet room, once a symbol of a grieving widow's solitude, was now a war room. They would spread his notes and her letters across the massive mahogany desk, their heads bent close together in the warm, golden glow of the lamp, their partnership a seamless fusion of his street-level intelligence and her high-level strategy. It was in these stolen late-night hours that their professional alliance began to transform into something deeper, more personal, more dangerous. The lines between strategy and intimacy blurred. She would notice the weary lines of exhaustion around his dark, intense eyes, and would insist he eat the warm meal she had kept waiting for him. He, in turn, would notice the slight tremor in her hands as she read a particularly harrowing report of an injury, and he would instinctively reach out, his rough, calloused hand covering hers in a gesture of quiet, comforting strength. They were two people from two different worlds, a woman of silk and a man of steel, who had discovered in each other a shared language of honor, of justice, and of a profound, unspoken loneliness. The attraction that had been a faint, dangerous undercurrent was now a powerful, undeniable force, a silent, beautiful, and terrifying truth that filled the space between them. The breaking point came on a cold night in late November. Marco arrived at the estate later than usual, his face grim, a new, cold fury in his eyes. "Lawrence has gone too far," he said, his voice a low, controlled growl as he stood before the fire. "He has just instituted the efficiency mandate. Any worker who does not meet the new, impossible daily quotas will have their pay docked. And any man who is injured on the job, if Henderson deems it to be the result of carelessness, will be fired immediately, without compensation. He is creating a system of fear and intimidation. He is daring the men to break." Eleonora's heart went cold. It was a brutal, monstrous policy. "He is trying to provoke a strike," she realized, her mind racing. "A strike he can then break with force, bringing in non-union workers and claiming to the board that he was forced to do so by an unruly workforce. He is creating a crisis to consolidate his own power." "The men are at their breaking point," Marco said, his hands clenched into fists. "There is talk of a wildcat strike, of violence. It is exactly what he wants. We are losing, Eleonora." She looked at him, at the desperate, frustrated anger on his face. She saw the immense weight he was carrying, not just for himself, but for all the men who now looked to him as their leader. "No," she said, her voice full of a sudden, fierce conviction. "We are not." She walked to her late husband's desk and retrieved a thick, leather-bound ledger. It was Arthur's private journal, filled with his notes, his plans, his very soul. She had spent weeks studying it, understanding the heart of the man she had loved and the company he had built. "When my husband designed the new wing of the mill," she said, her finger tracing a line in the journal, "he included a secondary backup generator here, connected to the emergency water pumps for the blast furnaces. It was a fail-safe, an expensive one that Lawrence argued against, but Arthur insisted. He said a man's life was worth more than a line in a budget." She looked up at Marco, a brilliant, dangerous idea forming in her mind. "The main power grid for the mill, the one that runs the production lines, is controlled from the foreman's office, but the backup generator, its control system is in a separate sub-level maintenance tunnel, a place no one ever goes." He stared at her, beginning to understand the audacious, beautiful insanity of what she was proposing. If the main power to the mill were to fail, on the very day the board of directors was scheduled for their annual inspection tour, she continued, her voice a low, excited whisper, and if the foreman was, for some reason, unable to restore it, the entire mill would be paralyzed. Production would cease. The contracts would be in jeopardy. Lawrence would be exposed, in front of the entire board, not as an efficient manager, but as a man who had lost control of his own company. "And the backup generator?" Marco asked, his heart beginning to pound with the thrill of her plan. "The backup generator," she said, a slow, dangerous smile on her face, "would ensure that the crucial safety systems for the furnaces remain operational. The mill would be stopped, but it would be safe. It would not be an act of sabotage. It would be an act of strategic maintenance. It was a perfect plan, a ghost in the machine. An attack that was both completely deniable and utterly devastating. It was a move that required perfect timing, a deep, intimate knowledge of the mill, and nerves of absolute steel. It required him. He looked at her, at the brilliant, fierce strategist who had just handed him the key to their victory. The respect and admiration he felt for her in that moment was so powerful, it was almost a physical thing. "It is a great risk, Marco," she said, her eyes searching his. "If you are caught, I will not be caught," he said, his voice full of a new, powerful confidence. He stepped closer to her, his gaze intense. "But a plan like this, it is not enough to be partners in rebellion. I must know, Eleonora. Are you with me? In all things?" The question was not about the plan, it was about them. It was about the future. She looked up at the handsome, honorable, and impossibly brave man who had come into her life, and reminded her what it felt like to fight, to hope, to feel. Her answer was as simple and as true as the beating of her own heart. "I am with you, Marco," she whispered. "Always." He leaned in then, and in the quiet, fire-lit intimacy of the library, amidst the blueprints of their secret war, he kissed her. It was not the hesitant, questioning touch at the garden gate. It was a kiss of absolute certainty, of a shared, dangerous purpose, of two allies who had, in the heart of their battle, finally acknowledged that they were fighting not just for justice, but for the profound, undeniable, and all-consuming love that had grown between them. The week leading up to the Board of Directors' inspection was a period of intense, nerve-wracking preparation. On the surface, life at the mill and the Vance estate continued its usual, predictable rhythm. But beneath this veneer of normality, a secret, silent war was being meticulously planned in the firelit quiet of Eleonora's library. The plan, which they had come to call Operation Ghost, was a masterpiece of strategic elegance, a testament to the perfect fusion of their two minds. Marco, with his intimate first-hand knowledge of the mill's inner workings, was the architect of the mechanics. He knew the maintenance schedules, the shift changes, the precise location of every crucial valve and switch. He knew the sub-level maintenance tunnel like the back of his hand, a dark, forgotten labyrinth that was about to become the stage for their rebellion. Eleonora was the master strategist, the queen on the chessboard. She orchestrated the timing, the social engineering, the very narrative of the event. It was she who wrote a formal, gracious letter to the board, insisting that their annual inspection tour be a more thorough affair this year. She framed it as a tribute to her late husband's commitment to excellence. "Arthur always believed," she wrote, her words a perfect blend of wifely devotion and shareholder concern, "that the strength of our company was not just in its profits, but in the flawless operation of its machinery. I would be so honored if you would allow me to personally guide you on a tour that would make him proud." Her invitation, so charming and so seemingly innocent, was a lure the board could not refuse. It also served to infuriate Lawrence, who saw it as a direct usurpation of his authority, a move that made him look like a secondary figure in his own company. His anger, she knew, would make him careless. The night before the inspection, Marco and Eleonora met for the last time at the garden gate. The air was cold and sharp, the moon a pale, slivered crescent in the dark sky. The time for planning was over. The time for action had arrived. "Are you certain of this, Marco?" she asked, her voice a low, worried whisper as she handed him a small leather satchel containing a set of specialized tools and a detailed schematic of the backup generator's wiring, a document she had found deep in her husband's private files. "The risk, if you are caught." He took the satchel, his rough, calloused hand brushing against hers. He looked at her, his dark eyes steady and full of a quiet, unshakable resolve. "When I was on that auction block," he said, his voice a low, intense rumble, "I had nothing left to lose but a life that was not worth living. You gave me back my honor, Eleonora. You gave me a reason to fight. There is no risk greater than the thought of returning to a world without you in it, fighting by my side. This is not a risk, it is a necessity." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, a gesture of profound, tender reassurance. "Go to the mill tomorrow," he murmured. "Be the queen. I will be the ghost in your machine." The following morning, the board of directors, a group of a half-dozen stern, wealthy men in expensive overcoats, arrived at the mill. Lawrence was there to greet them, his face a mask of forced, genial hospitality. And Eleonora was there, a vision of quiet, powerful elegance in a simple but exquisitely tailored black suit, her late husband's journal held in her hands as if it were a sacred text. She led the tour herself, her voice calm and authoritative, guiding the board members through the noisy, fiery belly of the beast. She spoke with a surprising, detailed knowledge of the machinery, a knowledge gleaned from her late husband's notes and her long conversations with Marco. She was not just a grieving widow, she was the intelligent, capable matriarch of this industrial dynasty. As the tour reached the heart of the mill, the massive, thundering, pressing line number 3, the moment arrived. Deep below their feet, in the dark, humid silence of the sub-level maintenance tunnel, Marco Rossi moved with the silent, swift grace of a phantom. He had disabled the single weak alarm system hours earlier. Now, with a set of specialized tools and a surgeon's precision, he approached the main power conduit. It was a simple, brutalist piece of machinery, the central artery that fed the lifeblood of electricity to the entire production floor. He worked quickly, his hands steady, severing the connection with a single, clean cut. Upstairs, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The deafening, relentless roar of the machinery died with a sudden, sickening groan. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the vast factory floor into a state of eerie semi-darkness, the only light the hellish orange glow from the blast furnaces. The great presses, which had been pounding sheets of steel just moments before, now stood silent and still. The entire massive heart of the Sterling Vance steel mill had stopped beating. A wave of panicked, confused shouts went up from the workers. The board members looked around, their faces a mixture of alarm and annoyance. Lawrence's face went pale with a horrified, dawning understanding. "What is the meaning of this?" Chairman Harrington demanded, his voice a furious boom in the sudden, unnatural silence. "A power failure, it seems," Lawrence stammered, his usual arrogant composure completely gone. He turned to the foreman. "Henderson, get the power back on, now!" Henderson and his team of engineers rushed to the main control panel, flipping switches, their movements frantic and useless. The mill was dead. It was in this moment of chaos that Eleonora played her final, brilliant card. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice calm and reassuring, cutting through the panic, "please do not be alarmed. My husband was a man who planned for every contingency. He installed a backup generator for just such an emergency. It is designed to automatically engage to power the essential safety systems." As if on cue, a new lower hum vibrated through the floor, and a series of emergency lights flickered to life, bathing the scene in a dim, ghostly glow. The critical water pumps for the furnaces were now running on the backup system. The mill was safe, but it was paralyzed. "It seems, Lawrence," she said, turning to her brother-in-law, her voice still polite but now with an edge of pure, cold steel, "that while the safety systems my husband insisted upon are functioning perfectly, the main production grid, for which you are responsible, has suffered a catastrophic failure on the very day of our board's inspection. How unfortunate for you." The board members stared at Lawrence, their expressions now a mixture of cold fury and dawning suspicion. They saw not an efficient manager, but a man who had cut costs, ignored safety, and had now been exposed in the most public and humiliating way possible, as a man who had lost control of his own mill. He was ruined. Deep below, in the darkness, Marco Rossi finished his work. He had not just cut the power, he had rerouted a single hidden circuit. Upstairs, the factory was dark, but down here, a single bare light bulb now glowed in a small, forgotten storage room. It was his signal. The ghost's work was done. As he made his way silently back through the dark, secret tunnels of the mill, a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. He had struck a blow against the man who had tried to crush him. He had won a great victory for the men who had trusted him. But as he thought of Eleonora, of her brilliant, audacious plan, of her unwavering faith in him, He knew that this was more than just a victory of justice. It was a victory of the heart. The grieving widow and the proud immigrant, their dangerous, beautiful alliance, had just brought an empire to its knees. The silence that fell over the Sterling Vance steel mill in the wake of the power failure was a deafening roar of failure, a failure that belonged entirely to Lawrence Sterling. In the dim, ghostly emergency light, the faces of the board members were a gallery of cold, unforgiving fury. They saw not a random accident, but a catastrophic failure of leadership, a company so poorly managed that it had literally ground to a halt before their very eyes. Lawrence, his face a pasty, sweating mask of panic, was utterly undone. He stammered excuses, he barked contradictory orders at his flustered engineers, but his authority had evaporated. He was no longer the confident, ruthless titan of industry. He was just a man who had been thoroughly and completely outmaneuvered. It was Eleonora who took control. Her voice, calm and steady, cut through the chaos. "Gentlemen," she said, addressing the board, "it is clear that the mill is in a state of critical disrepair. As the majority shareholder, and as the widow of the man who built this company, I cannot, in good conscience, allow this to continue. I am formally calling an emergency vote of no confidence in the current operational management. I am proposing that I, as the representative of the Vance estate, assume temporary, direct oversight of the mill's operations, effective immediately, until a full and independent safety and fiscal audit can be completed." It was a brilliant, perfectly timed coup. She was not just a grieving widow anymore. She was a queen, calmly claiming her throne in the midst of a crisis her rival had created. The board, desperate for a steady hand and seeing the undeniable strength and competence before them, agreed with a swift, unanimous vote. The war was over. Lawrence had been dethroned. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. Eleonora Vance, the woman who had once been a quiet background figure in the town, was now the most powerful person in it. She moved into her late husband's vast, imposing office at the mill, a space she had not entered since his death. But she did not come alone. At her side, no longer a spy in the shadows but her officially appointed chief advisor, was Marco Rossi. The immigrant worker who had been bought and sold like cattle was now a figure of immense authority, his presence in the executive suites sending shockwaves of disbelief and a newfound hope through the entire workforce. They were a formidable team. She was the strategist, the heart and the public face of the new regime, her quiet grace and iron will winning the loyalty of the board and the town. He was her enforcer, her expert, his intimate knowledge of the mill's every flaw, and his deep, unwavering connection to the workers, allowing them to implement changes with a speed and an efficiency that was breathtaking. Together, they began to heal the wounded company. They fired the cruel and incompetent Henderson. They reinstated the old safety protocols Arthur Vance had first established. They met with the workers, listening to their grievances, restoring their pay, and earning their fierce, unshakable loyalty. The Sterling Vance steel mill, under their joint command, was slowly, steadily coming back to life. Their partnership was no longer a secret. It was a public fact, a source of endless gossip and, for many, of inspiration. They worked side by side, day and night, their lives completely intertwined. But the love that had been confessed in a desperate stolen kiss in the library remained a quiet, unspoken truth, a powerful undercurrent that charged every shared glance, every brief touch of their hands over a set of blueprints. The moment of its final, undeniable acknowledgement came one evening, a month after they had taken control. They were the last to leave the mill, their minds weary but their hearts full of the satisfaction of a day of good, hard work. A light snow had begun to fall, the first of the winter, blanketing the grimy industrial landscape in a soft, peaceful layer of white. Instead of calling for her car, they decided to walk. They moved through the quiet, snow-dusted streets of the town, their shoulders brushing, their shared silence comfortable and profound. "It is a different world now, isn't it?" Marco said, his voice a low, wondering murmur as he looked at the mill, its windows now lit with a new, hopeful light. It is the world it was always meant to be, Eleonora replied softly. A place of dignity, of respect. They stopped in the small town square, the snow falling in thick, silent flakes around them, illuminating them in the soft glow of the gas lamps. He turned to her, his dark eyes full of an emotion so powerful it made her breath catch in her throat. I came to this country with nothing but the strength in my hands and a dream of a life of dignity, he said, his voice a raw, heartfelt confession. This country, it tried to break that dream. It tried to turn my strength into a form of slavery. It tried to tell me I was worthless. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his thumb brushing away a single, perfect snowflake. And then you came. You looked at me when I was at my lowest, a man being sold on a block, and you did not see a piece of property. You saw a person. You did not just buy my freedom, Eleonora. You gave me back my soul. He took a step closer, his hands framing her face. I have been your soldier in this war. I have been your foreman, your advisor. But my heart has been yours since the moment you held out your hand to me in that hall. I love you, Eleonora Vance. I love you with every fiber of my being. Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down her face, freezing on her cold cheeks. She looked at this incredible, honorable, and powerful man, her partner, her soldier, her king. Oh, Marco, she whispered, her own voice choked with a love so immense it was an ache in her chest. My life was a beautiful, silent house with all the lights turned off. You walked in and, one by one, you have turned them all back on. I love you too. He kissed her then in the heart of the quiet, snow-covered town square, a kiss that was both a triumphant celebration and a quiet, sacred vow. It was a kiss that sealed not a partnership of rebellion, but a partnership for life. The grieving widow and the proud immigrant had not just won a company, they had won a future. When they broke apart, he did not release her. He looked down at her, a new, joyful, and slightly nervous light in his eyes. My life is now in your hands, Mrs. Vance, he said, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across his face. I find myself in need of a new position, a permanent one. He took a deep breath. The man who had faced down thugs and foremen now facing the most important question of his life. I am applying for the position of your husband. I am told the benefits are considerable. She laughed, a sound of pure crystalline joy that echoed in the snowy quiet. Consider your application accepted, Mr. Rossi, she whispered. The position is yours. For a lifetime. The news of Eleonora Vance's impending marriage to Marco Rossi, the very man she had so publicly saved from the auction block, swept through Sterling Creek with the force of a tidal wave. It was a scandal, a romance, a legend in the making. The town, which had once been a source of judgment, was now the captivated audience to a love story that defied every known social convention. The narrative was no longer one of a grieving widow and a pitiable immigrant. It was the story of a queen who had chosen her own king, and a king who had risen from the ashes to claim his throne beside her. Their wedding was a testament to this new reality. It was not a grand society affair designed to impress the wealthy elite of Pennsylvania. It was a celebration for the people who had become their true family, the hard-working men and women of the Sterling Vance steel mill. They were married on a crisp, bright Saturday in December, not in the cold stone of a church, but in the vast, cathedral-like space of the mill's main hall, which the workers themselves had spent a week transforming. The cavernous space, usually filled with the roar of furnaces and the clang of steel, was now silent, cleaned, and decorated with garlands of pine and holly. The great soaring windows, usually coated in a layer of industrial grime, had been scrubbed until they gleamed, letting the pale winter sunlight stream in, illuminating the scene with a strange, beautiful, and almost sacred light. The workers and their families filled the hall, their faces full of a fierce, protective pride for the couple who had become their champions. Eleonora was a vision. Escorted down the makeshift aisle by the mill's oldest and most respected worker, she wore a simple but magnificent gown of deep winter white velvet. She had sold her late husband's diamond ring, but on her finger, she wore a new one, a simple, beautiful gold band that Marco had had forged for her by the mill's own master craftsman, its metal taken from the very first batch of steel produced under their new joint leadership. It was a ring that symbolized not inherited wealth, but the dignity of their shared labor. Marco stood waiting for her, a handsome, powerful figure in a simple dark suit. He was no longer the bruised and defiant man from the auction block. He was a leader, a man who stood tall and proud, his dark eyes full of a love so profound it seemed to fill the entire vast hall. He saw not a wealthy widow, not his benefactor, but Eleonora, his partner, his heart, his home. Their vows, spoken in clear, strong voices that echoed against the high steel rafters, were not the polite, generic promises of a society wedding. They were a declaration of their shared journey and their future purpose. "I came to you a man with nothing but his pride and his anger," Marco said, his voice a low, powerful rumble as he slid the simple, heavy gold band onto her finger. "You looked at me and saw not a problem, but a person. You gave me back my honor, and you gave me your heart. I promised to be your partner, your soldier, and your loving husband. I promise to help you build a world that is as just and as beautiful as your own soul, for all the days of my life." Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down Eleonora's face as she placed a matching ring on his finger. "I was a woman living in a beautiful, silent house, a prisoner of my own grief," she whispered, her voice full of a happy, trembling emotion. "You, Marco, you walked into my silence and you filled it with strength, with purpose, with a love I thought I would never know again. I promise to be your partner, your sanctuary, and your most devoted ally. I promise to stand with you, always." When the town's justice of the peace pronounced them husband and wife, a great, thunderous cheer erupted from the assembled workers, a sound that was more powerful and more heartfelt than any polite applause. Marco pulled his wife into his arms and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss that sealed not just their love, but their unbreakable alliance with the people they now led. The celebration that followed was a magnificent, joyous feast, a true festival of the working class. Long tables groaned under the weight of food prepared by the workers' wives, a vibrant, delicious mix of Italian, Polish, and Irish traditions. A local band played lively tunes, and the great hall was filled with the sound of dancing and laughter. It was into this scene of pure, unadulterated joy that the ghost of the past made one final pathetic appearance. Lawrence Sterling arrived uninvited, standing in the great doorway, his face a mask of cold, furious disbelief. He had come to witness the final foolish act of his sister-in-law's social suicide. He saw not a scandal, but a celebration. He saw not a disgraced immigrant, but a confident, respected leader of men. He saw not a grieving, easily manipulated widow, but a radiant, powerful queen, adored by her people and deeply, undeniably in love with her new king. He saw a world he had lost, a world he had never understood, a world that was now and forever closed to him. No one spoke to him, no one even seemed to notice him. He was an irrelevance, a ghost from a different, colder world. With a final look of impotent rage, he turned and disappeared, vanquished not by a show of force, but by the simple, unassailable power of their shared happiness. Later that evening, long after the last guest had departed, Eleonora and Marco stood alone in the center of the vast, silent hall. The air was still filled with the lingering scent of good food and the ghost of happy music. "Mrs. Rossi," he said, a slow, teasing smile on his face as he pulled her close. "It is Mrs. Vance Rossi, if you please, Mr. Rossi," she replied, a playful, happy light in her eyes. "A new partnership, a new name." He laughed, a deep, joyful sound that echoed in the magnificent space. "I like the sound of that," he said. He looked around the great hall, at the place that was the heart of their new shared life. "My entire life has been a battle," he murmured, his voice now a low, serious whisper as he held her close. a fight for survival, for dignity. But tonight, for the first time I feel at peace. That, she whispered, her head resting on his chest, is because you are finally home. He kissed her then, a long, slow, and deeply contented kiss. The grieving widow and the proud immigrant were gone. In their place stood a husband and a wife, a formidable, beloved team. Their secret war was over. Their public life, a life of shared purpose, of building a new and better world from the ashes of the old, was just beginning. And it was a life they would face, as they had faced everything else together. The first year of their marriage was a testament to the transformative power of their unlikely union. The sterling Vance steel mill, once a cold and unforgiving machine of industry, began to change under their joint leadership. It was a slow, deliberate process, a reforging of a company's very soul. Eleonora and Marco were not just a married couple. They were a revolutionary partnership, a perfect, seamless fusion of the boardroom and the factory floor, of silk and of steel. Eleonora, who had once viewed the mill as a gray, monolithic symbol of her late husband's world, now saw it as her own. She was no longer a grieving widow haunting the fringes of a board meeting. She was a queen in her own court. She did not rule from a distant, lofty office. Instead, she walked the factory floor with a quiet, confident grace, her elegant but practical attire a familiar sight amongst the heat and the grime. She learned the names of the workers, of their wives, of their children. She listened to their concerns, not as a benevolent benefactor, but as a partner. Her office door was always open, a stark contrast to the closed, guarded world her brother-in-law had maintained. Marco was her king, her general on the ground. He was the bridge between the executive offices and the hard-working men who toiled in the fire of the furnaces. He had their unwavering trust, their fierce loyalty. He understood their struggles because he had lived them. With Eleonora's backing, he implemented a series of radical changes. He established new, rigorous safety protocols, replacing the faulty, worn-out equipment that had been a hallmark of Lawrence's tenure. He fought for and won fair wages, and he instituted a profit-sharing plan, a concept so foreign to the industrial world of the 1920s that it was seen as nothing short of revolutionary. He was not just a foreman. He was their champion. Together, they were a formidable force. He would identify a problem on the factory floor, a dangerous piece of machinery, an inefficient workflow, and she would use her power as the majority shareholder and her quiet, unyielding diplomacy to push the necessary changes through the still skeptical board of directors. He was the sword, she was the steady hand that wielded it. The mill, which had been teetering on the brink of a violent labor strike, was now a model of industrial harmony, and, to the astonishment of its old guard investors, more profitable than ever before. Their home, the grand Vance estate, was also transformed. It was no longer a silent, lonely museum of grief. It became the vibrant, beating heart of their new extended family. On Sunday afternoons, the once manicured empty lawns were filled with the families of the mill workers. They would hold massive, joyful picnics, the air filled with a mix of Italian, Polish, and Irish accents, the sound of children's laughter a beautiful, chaotic symphony. Marco, the once proud and solitary immigrant, was now the beloved patriarch of this sprawling, multi-ethnic clan, dispensing advice, settling disputes, and organizing baseball games with a natural, easy authority. Eleonora was its matriarch, moving among the families with a warm, genuine grace, a queen among her people. Their love, born in the crucible of a public humiliation and forged in the fires of a secret rebellion, now deepened into a profound, comfortable, and unshakable partnership. Their nights were no longer spent plotting in a fire-lit library, but in quiet companionship. They would sit together, her head resting on his shoulder, his arm a familiar, protective weight around her, and they would dream. They dreamed not of greater profits or of expanding their empire, but of building a better world for the people who had placed their trust in them. It was from these quiet, shared dreams that their greatest legacy was born. "It is not enough to give them fair wages, Marco," Eleonora said one evening, as they looked out from their library window at the distant glowing fires of the mill. "A man cannot live on bread alone. His soul needs nourishment, too." She spoke of her late husband, Arthur, of his quiet love for books, for learning, for the world of ideas that existed beyond the grit and the grime of the factory. She spoke of the workers, of the bright, intelligent minds that were being dulled by a life of relentless, back-breaking labor, of the children who had no access to the world of knowledge that she had taken for granted. And so, they began their most ambitious project. They would build a library. Not a grand, intimidating institution for the town's elite, but a place of warmth and welcome for the working families of the mill. They would build it on the company's own land, a testament to their belief that a man's mind was as valuable as the work of his hands. The project became their shared passion. Marco oversaw the construction, using the mill's own skilled carpenters and masons, giving his men a new sense of pride in building something for themselves, for their own children. Eleonora, with her scholar's heart and her meticulous attention to detail, designed the interior and curated the collection. She filled the shelves not just with the great works of literature, but with practical manuals on engineering, with books on gardening, with histories of their various homelands, with children's stories in a dozen different languages. She was building a library that looked like their community. The day the Arthur Vance Memorial Library opened its doors was a greater celebration than their own wedding. The entire town was there. Marco and Eleonora stood by the entrance, and as the workers and their families poured into the beautiful, light-filled space, their faces full of a quiet, reverent awe, Eleonora knew they had built something that would last forever. A young boy, the son of a Polish furnace worker, shyly approached her, holding up a copy of Treasure Island. "Is this really for me, Mrs. Vance Rossi?" he asked, his eyes wide with wonder. "To take home?" "Yes, Joseph," she said, her own eyes filling with tears as she knelt down to his level. "It is for you, all of it." She looked up and her gaze met Marco's over the heads of the crowd. He was smiling at her, his dark eyes full of a love so profound, so complete, that it took her breath away. They had faced down a corrupt system, they had healed a wounded community, and they had built a sanctuary of knowledge. They had started as a grieving widow and a proud, broken immigrant. But now, as they stood together in the heart of the library they had built, surrounded by the people they had championed, they were so much more. They were the unshakable, beloved, and enduring heart of Sterling Creek. The years that followed their wedding were a testament to the quiet, powerful transformation they had brought not only to their own lives, but to the very soul of Sterling Creek. The Sterling Vance Steel Mill, once a symbol of industrial oppression, was now hailed as a model of progressive industry, a place where the dignity of the worker was valued as highly as the quality of the steel they produced. Their love story, which had begun in the harsh glare of a public auction, had become the town's founding myth, a story of a queen and a king who had risen from their own separate ashes to build a new and better kingdom together. Eleonora and Marco settled into a life of profound and purposeful partnership. The Grand Vance estate, once a cold and silent museum of her grief, was now the vibrant, beating heart of their world. They were a perfect fusion of two disparate worlds. She, with her quiet elegance and sharp, strategic mind, became a formidable presence in the boardrooms and with the financial backers of the company. She spoke the language of power with a grace and an integrity that disarmed the most cynical of investors. He, with his deep, unshakable connection to the working men and his innate understanding of the factory floor, was the undisputed soul of the mill. He walked the lines not as a boss but as a brother, his presence a constant source of inspiration and loyalty. Their home was no longer just a sanctuary for themselves, but for the entire community. The Sunday picnics became a cherished local tradition, a place where the rigid social strata of the town dissolved into the easy camaraderie of shared food and laughter. But they both knew that a community needed more than just a place to gather. It needed a place to grow. The idea for their greatest legacy was born as all their best ideas were, during a quiet evening in their library. They were looking through one of her late husband Arthur's old journals, filled with his dreams and plans for the town. He always wanted to build a public library, Eleonora said softly, her finger tracing a faded sketch in the journal. He believed that access to knowledge was the only true path to freedom, but the board always saw it as an unnecessary expense. Marco looked at the sketch, then at his wife, his dark eyes full of a new, powerful idea. He thought of his own childhood in a small, impoverished village in Sicily, where a single, tattered book was a treasure passed from hand to hand. He thought of the men at the mill, so full of a raw, native intelligence, but with no access to the world of ideas that could broaden their horizons. "Then we will build it for him," Marco said, his voice a low, determined rumble. "We will build it for them all, not as an expense, but as an investment, the most important one we will ever make." The project became their shared passion, the ultimate expression of their partnership. They would not just fund a library, they would build it with their own hands, and with the hands of the community it was meant to serve. Marco, the man who knew steel and stone, oversaw the construction. He used the mill's own architects to design a beautiful, modern brick building, full of light and air, to be built on a piece of company-owned land in the center of town. He offered the mill workers a chance to volunteer on their days off, paying them a fair wage for their labor, giving them the pride of building a monument for their own children. Eleonora was the architect of the library's soul. She spent over a year curating the collection, a task she undertook with a scholar's meticulousness and a lover's passion. She traveled to New York and Boston, to the country's finest booksellers, hand-selecting every volume. The shelves of the Arthur Vance Memorial Library would not be filled with the cast-offs of the wealthy. They would hold the best of the world's knowledge. She bought first editions of the classics, the latest scientific treatises, books on engineering and agriculture, poetry from around the world, and most importantly, a vast and vibrant children's section, a magical kingdom of stories designed to ignite the imaginations of the next generation. She designed the interior to be a sanctuary. There were no "quiet please" signs, no intimidating librarians peering over spectacles. There were comfortable, deep armchairs, warm reading lamps, and a magnificent stone fireplace that would roar with a welcoming fire on cold winter days. It was to be the town's living room. The grand opening in the autumn of 1933 was the greatest celebration in the history of Sterling Creek. The entire town was there, their faces full of a quiet, reverent awe as they walked through the beautiful, light-filled space. They ran their hands over the spines of the brand-new books, their eyes wide with a sense of wonder and ownership. This was not a gift that had been bestowed upon them. It was a home they had built together. Marco and Eleonora stood by the entrance, not as benefactors but as proud members of the community. A young boy, the son of a Polish furnace worker, shyly approached Eleonora, holding up a brightly illustrated copy of Treasure Island. "Is this really for me, Mrs. Vance Rossi?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "To take home for free?" "Yes, Joseph," she said, her own eyes filling with tears as she knelt down to his level. "It is for you. All of it." She looked up, and her gaze met Marco's over the heads of the happy, chattering crowd. He was smiling at her, his dark eyes full of a love so profound, so complete, that it took her breath away. They had faced down a corrupt system, they had healed a wounded community, and they had built this. A house of 1,000 stories. He came to her side and took her hand. "My father used to say," he murmured for her ears only, "that a man's legacy is the good he leaves behind in the world." He looked around at the vibrant, joyful scene. "You, Eleonora, have given me a legacy greater than any I could have ever imagined." "No, my love," she whispered, her hand tightening on his. "We have built it together." They stood there, hand in hand, in the heart of the library they had created, surrounded by the people they had championed. The grieving widow and the proud, broken immigrant were gone. In their place stood a husband and a wife, a formidable, beloved team. Their personal love story had blossomed into a legacy for their entire town, a testament to the fact that the most enduring empires are not forged in steel, but are built, page by patient page, from a foundation of shared knowledge, of compassion, and of a love that seeks to lift everyone up. The years flowed on, a steady, powerful current, shaping the landscape of Sterling Creek and the lives of its inhabitants. The Arthur Vance Memorial Library became the town's true center, a beacon of light and warmth that stood unwavering even as the dark clouds of the Great Depression gathered and broke over the nation. While other industrial towns withered, their mills falling silent, Sterling Creek, under the quiet, compassionate leadership of Eleonora and Marco, endured. The Sterling Vance Steel Mill, now a cooperative fully owned by its workers, a final radical act of philanthropy orchestrated by Eleonora before her retirement, became a symbol of a different kind of American dream, one built not on ruthless competition, but on shared struggle and collective strength. Eleonora and Marco grew old together, their love a quiet, beautiful masterpiece. They had filled the grand Vance estate not with children of their own, a small sadness they bore with a quiet grace, but with the sprawling, boisterous, and ever-growing family of the town itself. Their home was a haven, its doors always open, its kitchen always smelling of fresh bread and simmering soup. He was no longer Marco Rossi, the proud, broken immigrant. He was Papa Marco, the beloved patriarch of the town, a man whose quiet wisdom was sought on everything from a labor dispute to a failing crop. She was no longer Mrs. Vance, the grieving widow. She was Eleonora, the town's matriarch, its heart, its soul, a woman whose gentle strength was the glue that held them all together. Lawrence Sterling, a distant memory, had lost his fortune in the crash of '29, a bitter, forgotten man whose name was only ever spoken as a cautionary tale of a life lived without honor. One crisp autumn afternoon in the late 1930s, nearly a decade after their wedding, Eleonora and Marco sat on a quiet bench in front of their library. They were watching the children, the sons and daughters of the steelworkers, pour out of the building, their arms full of books, their faces bright with the excitement of 1,000 new stories. He was in his late 50s now, his dark hair streaked with a handsome silver, the fierce pride in his eyes softened into a deep, contented peace. She, now in her 60s, was more beautiful than ever, the lines on her face a testament to a life of laughter, of purpose, of a profound and lasting love. "Look at them," Eleonora said softly, her head resting on his shoulder. "They are the future we built, my love." "No," he corrected her gently, his hand covering hers, his touch as familiar and as comforting as her own heartbeat. "They are the legacy you built. You were the architect of it all. I was just the humble stonemason who helped you lay the bricks." She smiled, a slow, beautiful expression of pure contentment. "I seem to recall," she teased, "a rather handsome stonemason who faced down a room full of angry men, and with nothing but the truth, won a war." He chuckled, a low, warm sound. "I had a very good general." They sat in a comfortable, companionable silence, watching the life of their town unfold before them. Theirs was a love story that had become a local legend, a tale told to children by the fire on cold winter nights. It was the story of the brave, grieving queen who had traded her crown for a man's freedom, and of the proud, immigrant king who had helped her build a new and better kingdom. A young woman approached them, her face full of a shy, respectful admiration. It was Joseph's older sister, the daughter of the Polish furnace worker. She was now a young teacher at the town school, a position she had been able to attain thanks to a scholarship from the foundation Eleonora and Marco had established. "Mrs. Vance Rossi, Mr. Rossi," she said, her voice full of a quiet gratitude. "I just wanted to thank you for everything. The library, the school. You have given us all a world our parents could only have dreamed of." "The thanks belong to the community, Anna," Eleonora said kindly. "We only built the house. It is all of you who have made it a home." The young woman smiled, a look of profound, heartfelt admiration on her face, before continuing on her way. Marco turned to his wife, his dark eyes shining with a love that had only deepened with the passing of the years. "Do you remember the first day?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "In the town hall. I was a caged animal, and you were a queen from another world. I thought you were buying another beautiful, broken thing to add to your collection. And you," she whispered, "thought I was a fool, a sentimental woman playing at charity. We were both so wrong." "Yes," he agreed, his hand tightening on hers. "I looked at you and saw a benefactor. It took me a long time to realize that I was looking at my own heart." He leaned in and kissed her, a long, slow, and deeply loving kiss, a quiet, public testament to their incredible journey. The grieving widow and the proud immigrant had done more than just fall in love. They had healed a community. They had built a legacy. Their lives, which had begun in the ashes of their separate, broken pasts, had blossomed into a great and enduring love story, a story that would be told and retold, a permanent, beautiful, and indelible part of the history of Sterling Creek. The greatest legacies are not built from stone or steel, but from the quiet daily acts of compassion and courage. True strength is not the power to control others, but the willingness to empower them. Do not be defined by the station of your birth or the circumstances of your past. Be defined by the community you choose to build and the love you choose to give. A single, defiant act of kindness can start a revolution of the heart, proving that the most profound love is the one that finds its purpose in lifting up the world around it.